In Exodus, the 40th chapter, I'd like to start reading with you in verse 34. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was in it by night, in the sight of the house of Israel, throughout all their journeys. The book of Exodus ends very differently than how it begins. Israel has, at this point, been at Mount Sinai for probably a little bit over a year. So it's been a year and a half since they were slaves in Egypt. The change is pronounced when you go back to Exodus, the 2nd chapter, and read there how after the Pharaoh that knew Joseph died and other pharaohs arose, and they forgot about who Joseph was and why he was special. And so out of their fear, they enslaved the people of Israel. We're told in Exodus, the 2nd chapter, verse 23, that the people of Israel groaned out because of the slavery. They cried out to Jehovah for help, and that God heard their groaning, that he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And verse 25 in that passage, I think, is especially important, where it says, "And God saw the people of Israel, and God knew." Several months ago, I did a whole lesson on "and God knew." Maybe you remember it. I barely do. Just that God knows what's happening to his people. And that's really an amazing thought, isn't it? That no matter what you're going through in life, God sees, God knows what's happening. But if it's true that God sees and God knows, then why did it have to happen? Why did he allow his people to be in that slavery? Why did he have to allow all those horrible things to happen to them? And the answer, of course, it's a difficult thing to understand in so many ways. In Genesis 18, we can read where he had told Abraham that this was in fact part of the plan, that his people would be enslaved, his descendants would be enslaved for 400 years. So that tells us that there's more happening in this than just God allowing his people to suffer. This was part of what God wanted to accomplish in bringing them out of Egypt. So back to our text, Exodus, the 40th chapter. During this time at Mount Sinai, they've made a covenant with God. They are his people. He is their God. They have a special relationship. He even talks about it as, "You are my treasured people" at this point. They've received the law, the commandments that were brought through Moses, not just the commandments, the 10 commandments, but all the law was given to them at this time. So they have this basis of a relationship with him. They've received the instructions for the tabernacle. They've built the tabernacle as he instructed. And now it's finally time to head for the land that was promised to Abraham. It's time to go to that place. I want to back up just a little bit to that thought of the fact that God gave them instructions to build a tabernacle. Why did God choose a tent? Other gods, the gods that men imagine, when we think of where gods dwell, where do they dwell? The Egyptian gods dwelt up in the sky or in the darkness beyond that. The Greek gods that we're more familiar with dwell on Olympus, great big palaces, great, nice. The Norse gods in Valhalla. We can go on, right, with the great places. But Jehovah decides, I want a tent. Have you ever thought about that? Why would he choose a tent? In fact, in the very first verse that we're looking at, you'll notice two different words are used for that place. It's called a tent of meeting, and it's called the tabernacle. The tent of meeting focuses on the fact that it was like a nomad's tent. It was the common, that's the word, that if you were a nomad, that was home. This tent that you could pick up and move. It's still where you dwelt. It was your habitation. But this was a tent where all the people could meet together with God. The word tabernacle, and part of this is kind of confusing because our translators sometimes translate both these words tabernacle. Anyway, this word, other word tabernacle, focuses on dwelling place, that it's a dwelling place. So Leviticus 26, verses 11 through 13, where God says, I will make my dwelling among you, is related to that. But listen to that again. I will make my dwelling among you. I'm going to be with you. This is part of what God had planned all along, that he would dwell among them. In fact, that passage goes on in verse 12. He says, I will walk among you, and I will be your God, and you shall be my people. I'm walking with you, God says. So Jehovah chooses a tent. There's a part of me that says he could have waited, couldn't he, till they got to the promised land? It wasn't that far away. And once they got to the promised land, they could build a permanent place, right? They could build a nice big structure. That's what David wanted to do. You remember that? It's about 500 years later, after the tabernacle was done. But David is sitting in his nice cedar house. God's ark is in the tent, and he looks at that and he sees the disparity there. I'm in a nice house. God's place is a tent. And David, that's not right. That's not how, I'm guessing that's what David thought. That's not right. We can do better than that. He goes to Nathan and says, I want to build him a house. Nathan says, do what's in your heart. And God speaks to Nathan that night and says, no. Nathan messed up a little, I guess, there. He didn't check first. This is in 2 Samuel. Go there with me. 2 Samuel, the 2nd chapter. Sorry, the 7th chapter. 2 Samuel 7. And in verse 5, this is the message of Jehovah to Nathan. Go and tell my servant David, thus says Jehovah, would you build me a house to dwell in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I've been moving about in a tent for my dwelling. In all the places where I have moved with all the people of Israel, did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? So God's response is, I've never been in a house. I've always been in this tent. I've never asked anyone to build me a house. But as he's giving that answer, did you notice at the end of verse 6, beginning of verse 7, the language that he used? I've been moving about in a tent for I'm moving. And verse 7 says, in all the places where I moved with all my people. This tells us why he chose a tent. Tent's mobile. God wasn't a God of a specific place. He was God of a people. And where they were is where he's going to be. So God chose a tent. And we know that from the very beginning when he made that tent or gave them the instructions for that. In Exodus 25 and in verse 8, it says, have them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst. Why would God want to dwell in the midst of this people? I mean, just think about those first few months when they were traveling to Mount Sinai. What did he learn? What did we learn about the people of Israel? They were always grumbling and complaining. They didn't trust him. They didn't believe in him. At every step of the way, they were asking essentially that question, is God with us or not? Is that who you'd want to live with? Would you make that choice? To say I'm going to dwell in the midst of them means I'm going to be right there with them while they're in the wilderness, with all the difficulties, with all the struggles of being, I'm going to be, and he chooses to be with this people Not because they're perfect people, because they're clearly not, but because they're his people. So he chooses to be with them. In Exodus 33, another passage about Exodus 33 is that, if you recall, is after the people had sinned at Mount Sinai with the golden calf. And Moses tells them, you've sinned a great sin. And God says, because the sin is so bad, I'm not going with you anymore. And essentially, Moses in this passage says, well, if you're not going with them anymore, I'm staying here. I'm not going to go either. And so in Exodus 33, let's see, God changes that decision and tells Moses that he's going to go with him. Exodus 33, verse 14. And he said, this is Jehovah, and he said, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And this is what Moses says. And he said to him, if your presence will not go with me, don't bring us up from here. For how shall I be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not in your going with us, so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth? Moses has this incredible insight. If you don't go with us, then we're not distinct from everyone else on the face of the earth. Jehovah being present with Israel was unique and special. Moses recognized it. God understood it. The people needed to understand. There was something really incredible about God being with them on this. And that's really what we see in Exodus 40, the passage that we began with. At Mount Sinai, when they first got there, what did they see at Mount Sinai? You remember how it described the cloud, the darkness, the thunder, the lightning? The glory of God was there on Mount Sinai. And now, as they're getting ready to leave, the tabernacle's been built. It's all set up there. And what's going to happen? The cloud is going to move from Mount Sinai to the tabernacle. Mount Sinai, they'd received the law. They'd seen the glory of God there. They'd gotten the instructions for the tabernacle. Now that glory that they understood, it fills the tabernacle itself. So what happened at Mount Sinai, where they came to meet with God, is going to continue in the tabernacle. And the tabernacle is not going to just stay there, is it? It's going to keep moving with them. God was going to be with his people. And I want to argue that that's not just like a sappy sentimentalism or a metaphor or something like that. There's something really special that was happening here when God said, I'm going to go with you. So they have the glory of God. They can see that cloud at all times. When the cloud appears, they can follow it. If it stays, they can stay. And you notice twice in this journey it said throughout all their journeys. Throughout all their journeys, he's with them. It doesn't just say the tabernacle, he's with them. Not just the easy parts, the whole journey. So they know they're not alone. They know that they're not lost. There's a sense of that distinction, that confidence, that assurance, that awareness that he's with them. But why would God choose to go with them through the wilderness? The journey with all those difficulties. Let's let God answer. Deuteronomy chapter 1. We're going to look at 4 passages that I think answer this profoundly. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 31. This is after, as they're getting ready to go into the land of promise. This is 40 plus years later. Let's start in verse 30. Jehovah your God, who goes before you, will himself fight for you, just as he did for you in Egypt before your eyes. And in the wilderness, where you've seen how Jehovah your God carried you as a man carries his son, all the way that you went until you came to this place. I really love the picture that he gives here, don't you? He said, I carried you like a father carries his son. I understand that ultimately that's metaphor because he's not a father, but the picture of a father carrying a son is the father's there. He's bearing the burden. He's carrying the load. He's making it easier for that child. And God says, you've seen it. I was in the wilderness like a father carrying a child. Just stop and think about that. That's an incredibly profound thought. Isaiah 43. Isaiah chapter 43, and verses 1 through 7 is like the whole context of this, but this is a part where God is talking to the people of Israel. He's reminding them that I created you, that I redeemed you, and he's going to take care of them. So in verse 2, he says, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. For I am Jehovah your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. So, did they actually know that God was with them when they would pass through the waters and the rivers? Had they seen that? You know, the crossing of the Red Sea? Did they know God was with them at that moment? Incredible. How could they miss it? And of course, Paul uses that as being baptized into Christ. 1 Corinthians. He was there with them even at that moment. When they enter the promised land, the rivers stop again and they cross on dry. They had actually seen this. When you pass through the waters, he says, I will be with you. That's a powerful thought. Now, why does he say I'm going to be with you? Verse 4 answers that. He mentions 3 things about how God thinks about the children of Israel. He says, because you're precious in my eyes and honored, and I love you. How many wives want to hear that? How many of us love to hear that idea from someone that they would say, you are precious in my eyes, and I honor you, and I love you? That touches us, doesn't it? That's what God's saying to the people of Israel. Why is it that I'm with you through these? Why do I walk with you? Again, it wasn't because they were perfect people. And we sometimes emphasize how grumbly they were all the time. But God says, you're precious to me. They were the descendants of Abraham. He made that choice. You're precious to me, and I honor you, and I love you. That's why he wanted to be with them through all these things. Look in Isaiah 63. In this passage, Isaiah reminds us of God's steadfast love, which connects with his covenant, of his great goodness, of his compassion, of the fact that that he's their Savior. And I want you to notice with me in verse 9. In all their affliction, he was afflicted. And the angel of his presence saved them, and in his love and in his pity he redeemed them. He lifted them up and carried them all the days of old. So all the days of old, he lifted and carried. That reminds us of Deuteronomy, doesn't it? But that expression really got me, that first part of that where he says, in all their affliction, he was afflicted. That's why I say this isn't just sentimental. In all the affliction that the Israelites went through in the wilderness, it hurt God too. Don't think I'd ever thought about it that way until I noticed that. It wasn't just that God was somewhere observing them from a distance and saying, yeah, that looks rough. I really feel for those people. And I guess I kind of always thought of it that way before. But that's not what it says. He's with them. The tabernacle's there. He's walking with them. And now it says, in every way that they were afflicted, all their afflictions, he's afflicted too. Why? In his love and his pity, he redeemed them. He loved them. He had compassion. He was there with them in the wilderness, and he took care of them. And that's incredibly powerful. Go to the Book of Lamentations. Just a little bit of reminder about the context of the Book of Lamentations. The Book of Lamentations is written after God has allowed the Babylonians to come in and completely wipe out Jerusalem because of their repeated sinfulness. Many of the faithful were carried away to Babylon. City of Jerusalem, the temple, it's destroyed at this point. And Jeremiah in Lamentations is mourning what has happened to the people of Israel. As a part of that, we see this thought. Lamentations, the 3rd chapter, verse 31. For the Lord will not cast off forever, but though he cause grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he does not afflict from his heart or grieve the children of men. I could have seen a lot of the Israelites having a problem with those statements after their city had been razed to the ground by the Babylonians. It's very honest, verse 32. For though he caused grief. What happened to Jerusalem was because God allowed that to happen. He sent the Babylonians to do that. He caused the grief. For though he caused grief, he will have compassion. So he doesn't cast off forever. That wasn't the end of the story, as so often we do. And of course, it's verse 33 that really caught my attention again. He does not afflict from his heart or grieve the children of men. Okay, just these passages remind us that God was not just with them in a metaphorical sense, but that he suffered as they suffered. When he says in these verses, he doesn't afflict them from his heart. I'm going to struggle for an analogy to help us understand. A good surgeon doesn't want to do surgery. Because surgery is invasive. It causes a lot of damage. It causes a lot of hurt. But sometimes it's necessary. It's necessary to go in and to cut something out. So when a surgeon does do surgery, he does it willingly. Not just to punish, but to help ultimately in the end. So God is willing to bring grief. Not that he would want to, but it was necessary. So spiritually, this needed to happen so the people of Israel would stop their idolatry. He's the surgeon. I've got to do this. He didn't afflict from the heart. It wasn't just, I'm mad at you and I'm going to hurt you, I'm not going to punish you. It was much deeper than that. The language used in Lamentations speaks of steadfast love and compassion. God is willing to bring grief. But what these passages tell us is that in our distress, he's distressed too. So when we talk about God sharing in our suffering, it's not just sentimental, is it? We have a loving Father. If we can believe that he loves us, I think we can also believe that we have a Father who feels a pain, our pain, as it is his own. And isn't that what we see even in Jesus, that idea that he came to be with us? Matthew, the first chapter, verses 22 and 23, when Jesus is born of a virgin, it says his name shall be called Emmanuel, which is God with us. What does it mean that God's with us? Hebrews, the second chapter, verses 10 through 18. I'm not going to read all of them, just as a way of reminder. But in talking about bringing many sons to glory, what did Jesus do? He chose to be made like his brethren so that he would suffer in the same ways that we do. And in that suffering, partaking of the same things that we do, he becomes a great high priest to save us. He was tempted like we are, yet without sin. But he knows how to help us. He told the disciples before he ascended, "Lo, I'm with you always to the end of the age," Matthew 28, verse 20. With all of that said, I want to get to the really hard part of this lesson. And that is, if God is with us in that way, then why sometimes does it feel like he has forsaken us? I think the first part of the lesson is a profound thing, that he's afflicted it. In the wilderness, he suffered as they suffered. But the next question that we have to ask is, why do we sometimes feel like we're forsaken? Psalm 22 begins with that. My God, why have you forsaken me? Of course, we know that's what Jesus uttered on the cross. I feel like with many of the Psalms, this was also David's cry. Why have you forsaken me? Why would God let us go through hardships? Why is it that when we're being attacked by evil men that we have to endure these things? David prayed later in that psalm, "Be not far from me." He wanted God to be close to him. He said, trouble is near, and there's no one to help. I need you. Remember how he talks about being surrounded like by the bulls of Bashan? He was surrounded by evil. There was no one to help. Why have you forsaken me? Earlier we read Psalm 13. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? When you have a question that begins with how long and ends with forever, there's a problem there, isn't there? How long will you forget me forever? Because David at that point is saying what? You've completely forgiven me. Not forgiven, sorry. Forgotten. Completely forgotten me. His next sentence in Psalm 13, how long will you hide your face from me? Does David feel like God is with him? How long, he says, will I take counsel in my soul? What does that mean? I take counsel in my soul means I'm having to do all the thinking for myself. I don't have anyone to talk to. I don't have anyone to guide me. I'm by myself. And then he says, and as part of that how long, and have sorrow in my heart all the day. We don't know exactly what prompted this psalm, Psalm 13, but David was hurting and he felt alone. He was full of sorrow. He had an enemy. I think that's the very next line in verse 2. How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? So he's being unfairly attacked. How long? Does David feel forsaken? Clearly he does. He feels like God is not with him. How do we cope with this difficult thing of saying that God is with us and his affliction is like our affliction, and this feeling of being forsaken by God? Do you not think that many of the Israelites felt the same way, both in what happened in Jerusalem when it was sacked by the Babylonians, and then even in Babylon, that they felt forsaken? How do we cope with these things? Psalm 13 provides a little bit of insight for that. As you read on in verse 5, as he comes to the close of it, he says, but I have trusted in your steadfast love. Steadfast love is a covenant love, right? I'm your God, you're my people. He says, I have to trust that. So as a part of this knowing that God is with us, when we feel forsaken, we have to go back and say, I know he's with me. I trust that he's here with me. And I think that's important for us to understand then when it says our affliction is his affliction. As Exodus 2 said, God saw and God knew. Those things are there. That's part of it. He then makes the next statement in verse 5. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. Clearly, he's anticipating that salvation, isn't he? Because at the moment, he feels completely forsaken. But here, what a contrast this is to find that joy in salvation. Because in verse 2, he had mentioned, I have sorrow in my heart all day long. Now he says, I'm going to look with joy. I'm going to let my heart think about the salvation that you've promised. Verse 6, typical for David, right? I will sing. David loved to sing. We need to love to sing. There's something special about singing. I'm going to sing to the Lord. And then he says, because he has dealt bountifully for me. So I'm going to sing because God has been good. That one's hard, isn't it? Because he's in the midst of having an enemy. And he says, you've forgotten me and you've hidden your face. But he has to go back and say, I remember the good that God has done. I know that he's dealt bountifully for me. I know he's tried to help. So I'm not giving you an answer to that dichotomy. What I want you to focus on is this remembrance, this incredible thought that God has said, I am with you. Hebrews, the 13th chapter, he reminds us of that. I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? It sounds too good to be true. And for David, sometimes it didn't always feel like it was true, right? But when we look at this world that we have to go through, this wilderness, with its trials, with its struggles and difficulties, with the enemies who attack us, those who hurt us, those who do things to us that are evil, this is the good news. He's walking this way with us. And what we're suffering afflicts him too. And even in those times when we feel forsaken, God wants us to know he's hurting too. He sees, he knows. And ultimately, he's there with you. So we can take courage. And we can turn to him in trust, like David said. And we can rejoice. And we can sing. We want to offer an invitation this morning. If you believe that Jesus is the Christ, you want to use this moment because of that belief to repent and be baptized. If you need our prayers and help, please come forward as we stand and sing.